So for those of you who don't know, I'm Nikita Reed. I'm one of the co-chairs of ZNCC, along with Lori Ferris, Charlie Kring, and also Scott Henson, who's not able to be here today. So ZNCC, so we are a strategic alliance, and we are really championing the responsible reuse of existing and historic places towards a zero net carbon future. When this organization was started almost 6, 7 years ago at this point, there weren't that many people talking about the impacts of existing buildings within the climate action conversation. So we're thrilled to know that the conversation has shifted now. But the different organizations that you're seeing on the screen are the ones who are really involved in ZNCC and help us figure out what we're going to do next. How can we be helpful? And so a lot of what we do is really trying to bring a lot of different organizations together so that we can all get out of our silos because we realize that there was a lot of great work happening at the different institutions. So with architects or preservationists or carbon folks. So we're really trying to make sure that more professionals are talking to each other. And so one of our steering committee members is the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, also known as CAHP, and that is who Carly is going to be talking about today and some of the work that they're doing. But all the organizations that you're seeing on the screen are part of the ZNCC steering committee. So with that said, I will now give you Carly's bio so we can get into her presentation. Thanks, Charlie. Carly Connor has worked across academia, heritage masonry construction, and building science consulting, and thrives at bringing the heritage community together to work collaboratively to solve project challenges and provide solutions. Carly is on the board of the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals. She's chair of the CAHP Educational Committee and an active member of the CAHP Advocacy Committee, focusing on embodied carbon, policy, climate action, and circularity. Carly is the incoming chair of the APT Technical Committee for Sustainable Preservation and the CAHP representative to the ZNCC. She's practiced within the engineering community over the last decade, focusing on mentorship and development of women across the industry. More recently, Carly is the CEO and founder of Green Salvaged Materials, a consulting and materials company that focuses on generating the connection between the heritage and sustainability communities through discussions around adaptive reuse, deconstruction, material salvage, and reintegration of used materials into the design ecosystem. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Carly Connor.
Thanks, Nikita. So I'm here to talk about CAHP's role in uniting heritage and sustainability through embodied carbon, and I'll tell a little bit of the story of, I guess, how we came to the ZNCC, how sort of I saw the need to integrate sort of CAHP and APT worlds together, and I think through what I'm going to share on sort of CAHP's journey in this space, as well as bringing in some key aspects of discussions and presentations and workrooms at the APT and National Trust Conference that happened last week. You'll see kind of how that story goes together. No, it's not advancing. There we go. All right. So who am I? So I started off in academia thinking that I was going to be a professor, but really loved project management and soon switched to the private sector as a restoration contractor. And then really wanted to get my hands dirty solving the problem right off the bat. And I've been in sort of building science consulting for the last 10 years. And over the last few years, as my next slides will show, taking a really increased role within CAHP, primarily through the advocacy committee and their discussions on existing buildings. That in my role as a building science consultant, I was the heritage specialist in sort of a large firm. But I was just dealing with existing buildings in my regular day-to-day and could really see our work in heritage and the work in the existing buildings community, but also was exposed to a lot of new construction language around sustainability and could start to see these connections and started getting more involved in some of the associations in order to sort of bring these conversations together. So I'm now a board of director for CAHP and also saw the need sort of within the last year to join the technical committee for sustainable preservation as part of APT, to sort of merge our worlds together, to sort of start breaking down some of the silos, and sort of through a lot of the work that I'll present today. It may be of no surprise in the last sort of 2 months, I've now founded my own business within sort of this system in order to solve a missing piece of the puzzle. So I now run Green Salvage Materials. All right, so who is CAHP? especially for those in the US that might be showing up to this conversation and might not have heard of us, or those of you in Canada. Who are we? So we represent members who are professionally and actively engaged in the heritage community. And what I really love about this organization is it's not just architects and engineers. It's looking at all levels of government. It's looking at storytellers. It's looking at people that are very much in the weeds of the cultural heritage and natural heritage and even some Indigenous heritage side of the business. And it's integrated through with trades and crafts and contractors and architects and engineers. And it's kind of this unique little space to bring us all together. So our part of our role is to establish and maintain principles and standards for our practice, and to foster knowledge sharing, and sort of promote the value of preservation in our field. And the CAHP Advocacy Committee, of which I'm now the chair, it previously existed mostly as like a role to support the conservation of material heritage where it was warranted, and enhance our profession, but it was dormant for a while. And particularly a few of my sort of cherished colleagues that were in the existing building space and heritage professionals saw the need to reinvigorate it in 2020 to really talk sustainability in existing buildings. That there was sort of this missing gap of we are the existing building specialists in heritage, mostly because our buildings are still here and we're keeping them alive for a really long time. But there was a gap that we needed to sort of bring our knowledge to the market and start having these wider conversations, especially given the breadth of our organization. So what that looked like was a TEDx talk, and then really evolving into the first workroom, kind of post-COVID, that really dove into a lot of issues. So from that workroom, we created the green paper, and I'll kind of go through that now to give you a snapshot of how really heritage and sustainability sort of obviously start to link. The main goal is in order to address sort of GHG reductions in buildings that, is starting to finally be the conversation. Everyone can talk sort of operational efficiency, we can talk GHG emissions, but in order for that to happen, we need to identify how to adapt our buildings, come up with creative solutions to reuse and conserve them and the related resources rather than demolishing and discarding the building materials. That was sort of the key objective. It's, come out from so many different published sources of that this is what needs to happen, but how and by who and where's the expertise hiding? So the goal of the workroom in 2021 and evolving to sort of publish the green paper over the following year was to look at kind of all of the different headings I have on the screen. And I'll put some links to some of these papers and stuff sort of once the presentation wraps up. But looking at perception, that even to this day, like I'm having conversations that I'll show later in the slide, of it's perceived that, working with existing buildings is incredibly hard or impossible. It's like how to bring our expertise to the table. How can we use whole life carbon calculations to tell a different story? But these are discussions that, really came into full force sort of 3 years ago, and are needing us to champion. We need to look at education. It takes a lot of collaboration working with existing buildings. It's not the normal sort of new construction world where you have an architect and a bunch of individual engineering disciplines that can just work in our silos and hand in some drawings and get a building built. There's a lot of collaboration that needs to happen. There's a lot of social value, that there's a connection of those buildings to the neighborhood. People are engaged with what happens to those buildings and on a very different level. It's also starting to look at, metrics. How can we start to really put numbers to what we do? So this is when I showed up. I would say I hadn't necessarily been an active member of CAHP up until then, but in Toronto, the next version of the workroom where the green paper was sort of presented was discussed, and the venue can set the tone for what happens. So that particular workroom happened to be in a large hotel complex in downtown Toronto that was slated for demolition. That it wasn't a super old historic building. It was just, it's Toronto and buildings are coming down to build new ones all the time. But it set a tone of the entire conference. For me, for the first time, to really show up and have these really cross-discipline conversations for the first time, not just from a technical, how do we, work with existing buildings perspective, but starting policymakers are there, government's talking, cultural people are there, there's the trades people are there, you're having all of these different discussions. And what we looked at was we just put a sample building out there. There was another building in Toronto that, was a lot of concrete. And as are many of our buildings, sort of built sort of in the last century. But it didn't work. It either had all of its sort of windows and mechanical systems and, everything really needed a revamp. But it didn't mean the building itself wasn't any good, but like what would happen to this building? It was also happened to be an architecture building on a university campus. There was no heritage designation to it yet. But like, did it have cultural value? There were so many question marks of all of us in the room of like, what should happen to this building? That you also put the hat on of a building owner or developer to say, if we can't answer what should happen to this building, how could we expect a building owner to know all of these options up front and consider them when they're making those first decisions? So we really got down to sort of brass tacks and like really workshopped a project and say, what is all of this knowledge that we as architects and engineers know about existing buildings, and how can we bring it to the start of the conversation? And for us, at least in Ontario, and in other parts of Canada, we go through a process to write a heritage impact assessment. And that says, like, is this building like of heritage value or not? And it's a lovely document, and we have sort of a whole industry around it. But there's a small subset of that document that talks about the structure and talks about the envelope, and gives some information about like, is this a good building? But is there more information we could maybe bring to that reporting, and help have a better conversation right up front when that report is being generated? The other big impactful piece of that conference was a session where the government really stood up, really sort of impassioned and say, whatever comes out of all of these carbon or sustainability conversations or heritage, it just needs to be like a seatbelt. And for all of us, I'd say she was the person that spoke was of an older generation, but like very much remembered a time when there weren't seatbelts. But now it's the first thing you do when you get in the car. It's for safety. And it was an immediate correlation of like something that's easy, that fits into any car assembly. That's the first thing you do at the start of the project, and is for the safety of the planet. And it was this key like connection point to kind of set a groundwork for like, how can we work with what we have and just like notch things up or give a little bit more information and keep parts of our current sort of building permit structure in order to have a real impact. So fast forward a year later, a lot of these ideas percolated. And what we did for the 2023 workroom was to sort of get everyone in the room and throw out their like big key sort of barriers or obstacles or opportunities or like issues in heritage conservation. And a lot of the big ones, we were talking embodied carbon, we were talking circular materials, we were talking insurance, we were talking like, do we build replicas? Like when the building really isn't a good building anymore, but it has so much cultural value, like kind of having a real discussion about, are we rebuilding it back to its original state, even if it's, fully kind of taking it down and putting it back up? Or are we going to kind of allow for some other situations to happen? The other parts, because of the sort of the uniqueness of CAHP, we had so many sort of municipal and government professionals in the room really asking, how do we start policy? That we started looking at some of the policies that were happening elsewhere. We were starting to look at some circular materials that, that have evolved even so much more since sort of a year ago. But how do we start? That it isn't every municipality kind of on their own, not knowing really where to kick things off and to do it in a right way, in a consistent manner for the industry. The other key part that happened at the same time, that's sort of a unique thing to Canada, is Vancouver and Toronto at the same time published embodied carbon policy for new construction. So what that did is it's sort of integrated a limit of embodied carbon per square foot or per square meter that can be spent on a new development. So there was finally like a cap in the tier. But we looked at these policies that, you know, are great for sustainability. We asked, what about the existing buildings? That they really weren't considered. That it was like, what was the building on the site first that was taken down in order to build this really big, lovely, green, energy efficient net zero thing? Like, how do we have that conversation and not lose the opportunity to do that? So we'll fast forward to this year and where we went with the workroom this year. So we looked at CAHP having it hosted the workroom, but we jointly did it with APT, given that it was a joint conference this year. And it was our ability to really get technical. And what's been sort of inspiring over the last few years is that 2 years ago, not many people knew what the word embodied carbon was. And last year, people came with embodied carbon presentations and people got it. It's like, hey, we know what it is. It's like, how do we use it? How do we talk the language? What does it mean to each of us that do kind of something different in our field? So what we felt was important was to sort of learn the practical side. In Canada, the REIC paired with CAHP over the last few months to deliver full building LCA training across Canada, which was greatly received, but it was, you know, focused on new construction. And we really looked at what about existing buildings? Can we use sort of this opportunity of the workroom as a crash course to throw sort of a bunch of key things at people in the room to let them know how to work with sort of a whole building LCA assessment? How could this apply? What are the different ranges of projects or materials or assemblies that this could apply to? And how does it like apply to me? Like when I'm leaving that workshop, like how can I use the information of embodied carbon in my day to day? And be that for an entire building where we're doing a full adaptive reuse project and we need to quantify that, or we're just comparing one repair versus another. Sort of one person gave the example of like, here's two structural, it's the same structural repair, but I could use wood or I could use steel. You know, how does that actually shake out? Being able to look at different levels. So Lori was great. Lori Ferris, sort of my APT co-chair, came and gave the crash course. And it's really good feedback. But it was a discussion point sort of after this of everyone was there at the workroom. You know, we had sort of 65 people. We were able to like train 65 people in a crash course. But what next? How to actually disseminate this information more broadly to the existing building community where it's desperately needed. So there are just sort of follow-up points for anyone that wants to have this discussion after of whether to disseminate that as a sort of follow-up workshop in a similar manner that the REIC did, whether that's pairing through APT to deliver different types of workshops or webinars or, you know, working webinars, what that looks like. But we're also wanting to hear from everyone of what's out there. What are the missing pieces when we're talking existing buildings? And then we're talking our older building stock as well that's needed in order to change that narrative and have the conversation. The other part that we felt was really important was to do a policy dive. And when we asked all the participants to sort of be aware of the policies in their area, I'll say the overwhelming response is like, we're architects. We don't do policy. I'm not really like, I don't write policy. We're not in the policy realm. But the goal of what we looked at was that we work with the policy every day. And policy is happening whether we're at the table and aware of it or not. And that there's a huge opportunity to merge our policy makers, especially on the language of sustainability as the leading experts in existing buildings. So we looked at operational energy policies that are really driving our work and that we could see throughout the conference and people talking about deep energy retrofits, how to insulate our buildings, you know, how to navigate change to a building to accommodate sort of different sustainability measures. Started to look at some embodied carbon policies that are coming out. And then really looking at a whole range of deconstruction policies, whether it's a full ordinance that a few people I know on this call have, or really just some small changes that can be made to spec or processes or a standard that can have a really, really big impact, either as a groundwork for a future ordinance or in lieu of. So going from last year's workroom, where we really got into looking at some policies, and particularly in Toronto, where we had lovely embodied carbon policies, and we were asking, what about existing buildings? It was sort of kismet that a week later I met the person that wrote that policy. And we had the discussion, like, what about existing buildings? That as part of our CAHP workroom, we had really road mapped, what's a good existing building policy, kind of from, the start to the finish. And then I was actually able to have that conversation with policymakers. It was also coincidence that Ryan had just received the sort of grant funding to write the Ontario Embodied Carbon Toolkit, which was to specifically look at circularity. And in that, he was approaching it from sort of looking at operating carbon, embodied carbon, and looking at, we kind of have operating carbon figured out. We really need to dive into the embodied carbon part of it. And he was starting to see that existing buildings were a part of the solution. It just wasn't part of policy yet. And key to this sort of unlocking of sort of the next conversations was in Canada. We looked at a guide for whole building life cycle assessments, that if you have an existing building or reusing materials on the same site or reusing materials from another site, they count as zero carbon at the moment, which really is a huge opportunity. Have a sustainability discussion using our existing building. So I invited Ryan to the conference to give this chat. So I've stolen his slides to give a mini snapshot of what he presented. But the toolkit that he was putting together was in conjunction with CAHP climate design, where CAHP was looking at urban design guidelines, procurement of low carbon materials, and Ryan was looking at the low carbon materials and circularity. And a lot of us have seen this slide where it's sort of like build nothing, but then build less. We're repurposing, we're refurbishing, we're reusing. How do we really look at this part of the discussion and not just focus on the build efficiently? That sort of had been the conversation previously. So where we got with this is we really discussed like what's a good building and how to integrate that into policy. We had looked at talking about the heritage impact assessments that we, had looked at the year before. How can we call them demolition impact assessments? How can we look at material salvage that we're already asking for in some of our heritage reports and just give that meat across all buildings? How can we say, like, what's a good building? Like, is the structure any good? Is the envelope any good? And integrate all of those conversations up front as a holistic conversation and tie it to sustainability funding. So the idea was answered that it all starts with the structure. Is the structure any good? Yes or no? Then if the structure is great, like we want to keep it. How do we do that? If the structure is great, but the envelope kind of all needs to be renewed, this is a great deep energy retrofit building. And then sort of so on. And if it, the structure needs to go, how do we navigate this? We need some documentation. So what Ryan and I got into was looking at pre-development or a pre-demolition audit. So pre-development is like, you're right at the start, what should you do with this building? Have a sort of documentation that can answer some of those questions. And if you do end up deciding that, like, yes, this building needs to come down, how do you look at a pre-demolition audit to understand what might have value in that building to consider in that demolition process? So in Ontario, we do have some existing waste regulations. They are not currently enforced. There is a way to tie a lot of sort of best practices in, what to keep in an existing building into the demolition permit process that we identified. In a complete sort of coincidence, as we were developing sort of these ideas and these strategies, we connected with the City of London in England, and our policies started to match. And they had some lovely fancy diagrams that weren't me handwriting something out in a PDF. So this diagram here is snatched from their policy, where they started with trying, circular audits and trying to be circular, and ended up being, like, this is an embodied carbon policy at the end of the day. We started with an embodied carbon policy and worked down to being circular. But everything started to match, including our sort of decision tree flow chart that we've shown there, that can really highlight, what's a good building. Is this a retain and retrofit? Is this kind of a partial, like, where some of this is good to keep? Are we disassembling and reusing it? Are we just sort of carrying on as normal? Let's demolish and recycle. But trying to really implement that type of framework and tying it back to carbon value is the real opportunity. So where this is, it's looking at deconstruction salvage and how to incentivize it. So there's looking at We looked at building permit fees, we look at race schedules, we looked at tipping fees. We looked sort of across the whole building spectrum, and there's sort of a number of opportunities that were identified. The main thing, especially where it comes into our work, is looking at needing a secondary materials market, but also of how to reuse the materials. So these conversations are happening in a new construction context. And I won't completely say in all aspects, like they think they're reinventing like material reuse, but to some degree they are. Whereas especially our field that works with existing buildings all the time has a lot of expertise in material reuse to bring to the table and have these conversations. That, it's a way to have the new construction, salvage, and circularity conversation, but also really make a case for adaptive reuse in the first place. So I encourage you all to sort of dive into your local policy. That maybe some of these ideas might spur some real connection to your work. We also invited at the conference now a friend, Meredith Moore, from Ouroboros Deconstruction, present on sort of the state of deconstruction in Canada and what that really looks like. In heritage, we do deconstruction all the time. In the demolition world, construction is a new thing, and how to speak the language in sort of a way that everyone understands. That there's been a lot of really great work that's happened over the last year that we wanted to highlight, particularly with all for reuse, doing an entire reuse roadmap that can help sort of all of you find the people in your local area a lot easier across sort of the construction world to training to government policy space. But we also introduced reclamation audits. How do you walk into a building and say what has value? Of not just saying what has heritage value to salvage, but what has value. They're a way to have sort of a conservation plan in heritage, then you have a salvage plan, then you have a demolition plan. And how to standardize this, what does it look like? How can we integrate these plans into standard practice? And really have conversation starters, where's the easy stuff to start with? What has impact? What has significance to the community that they would want to see retained? And just have these little notches on our development that can really amplify this process forward. Or we can go into a single family home and fully just deconstruct it and have that great story to tell as well. So the other parts I wanted to quickly highlight was the work that's happening at the McGill Structural Lab. And I think I'll highlight the work that's going on in McGill, but there's so much work happening across the country in academia that is hidden, that isn't necessarily known or able to be shared and to build off of each other. So it's one thing of I'd love to be able to pull all the McGills together to be able to see it easily. But there's been a lot of funding injected through this lab. One, to look at how to better retrofit our URM masonry buildings, particularly because there's sort of 40% of low-rise construction in Ontario, Quebec, and still have a lot of life potential in them, but they do need to address some seismic concerns. So government has gotten behind that in order to give some money to sort of put that process to paper. They've also been doing a lot of material testing, particularly for brick, to help identify sort of some key barriers to material reuse, mostly because the CSA in Canada requires sort of all material going into new construction to match the same as existing. So if we're reusing material, it has to meet all of the same standards as new brick. But an old brick is not designed the same as a new brick. And it's unpacking those discussions and where do you need the testing and where do you not, that's sort of catalyzing this conversation forward, which goes to best practices in education, which is sort of where we are right now as an industry, and a lot of discussions are happening. So all of this is very fluid right now to say we can save a lot of buildings, and especially as I at least got into policy, to say we can really write a policy that might capture a lot of our really good buildings and show how useful they can be, that they're a really good 500, 100-year building that still has a lot of life in it. But we need to teach people that it can't just be the heritage community delivering those services and knowledge, that we really need to expand that knowledge base. And how do we do it? Especially when so much of our education is through institutional knowledge and working, on projects as we develop. It's not, here's this course and primer and you're good to go. You know what you're doing. It's a lot of learned nuances and how to share, how to work with, existing codes in the absence of really good codes. So what we're doing right now, for anyone that's interested, is we're kind of getting our best practices on paper. That to say for materials, particularly for brick, is our starting point. To say we reuse brick all the time. Can we put our parameters under which we do that on paper as a starting point to build off from, to integrate with academia, to integrate with the Canada Masonry Design Center, and to work towards standards, and how we can sort of break down some of the barriers on our projects so that we're not having to test everything and have huge price tags to reuse. But also looking at buildings, that how do we teach people to navigate the existing code? How do we advocate for better changes to the code? We had a lot of amazing discussions last week as to how to do this and how to bring sort of the knowledge that our profession has into a broader existing building space, with a real opportunity, especially under sort of different sustainability and carbon discussions, to get that education disseminated. The other part the CAHP is doing is, over the last year in particular, has reached out to all of our academic institutions that have various levels of heritage programming and trying to get visibility on those programs, so that they're not just offered sort of to the at the junior level of like people in sort of college or university, but that we're able to potentially package up a lot of those programs from a continuing education standpoint and potentially develop a micro certificate for anyone that's interested. So we've created a bit of a roadmap, starting to have those conversations to at least give visibility to all of the education and training that exists so we can really dive into where the gaps are. And then why all of that is important and why we should pay attention to policy and why we should care about all of the things we've mentioned today is that people are having discussions without existing building professionals like really at the table. So in new construction in Canada, people are starting to talk circularity. They're talking new construction and circularity. They're talking design for disassembly. And from that, they're really getting it and seeing that like we need to talk adaptive reuse in existing buildings. We need to talk deconstruction and reuse of materials. That if we're going to design for disassembly, we need to disassemble the stuff we already have, and starting to have these conversations. However, there's so much of a wealth of knowledge that our existing buildings community has that's hidden, that often we're not normally in the same conversations with, the new construction policy professionals. And that really needs to change because there's a huge opportunity to bring all of our knowledge to the table and show like where are our barriers to really like promoting this and making this a standard practice and working with them, because people are showing up to the table to have conversations and we just need to make sure we're there. So in Canada, for anyone interested to follow along, the Circular Economy Leadership Canada has been working with the CSA on some amazing reports for the last few years on breaking down sort of the what does circularity look like in the construction space. And it's a huge systems level problem, but they got it on paper at least, which is a huge challenge. But we kept saying, like, if we know what the problem is and we kind of know how to fix it, it's just a really big problem. How do we start that? So right now, next week, they are launching the Circular Construction Innovation Hub in conjunction with the CSA and a bunch of other government partners, a lot of municipalities, a lot of different sort of architecture engineering firms that are looking at the 3 work streams that are listed, and to sort of get into standards and policy procurement, financing, skills and training, but really just trying to pick like what's our key barrier and problem, and can we think tank this as an industry and really get somewhere. It's obviously a complex problem. You can talk about all different kinds of materials, and are we talking single family residential? Are we talking large sort of ICI buildings? The conversation is happening. So I just encourage everyone to be aware of those conversations and opportunities. So CAHP is currently partnered with the Codes Acceleration Fund in Canada to deliver a program on existing and heritage buildings and really analyzing sort of the carbon value of those buildings, particularly from an energy perspective, and energy upgrading in order to provide some valuable education content that can provide that can give some building owners sort of some base level knowledge of where certain building topologies are in regards to energy performance, and then some suggested measures in which to improve them. So this project is just kicking off now, so you'll hear lots more coming out of it. But there's opportunities sort of across our system to bring our knowledge to the table of people that are really trying to fill in the gaps of code or accelerate code or find, where there might be some areas that need some more clarity in the code, and there's an opportunity to sort of get involved. The biggest things I want to leave with this is what I'd say CAHP is struggling with and APT is struggling with. We had a conversation this morning within the sustainable preservation group of we're heritage professionals. Our organizations are heritage and preservation professionals. This is, who our group of existing, people are. But there's so much knowledge that we have that we need to bring to a broader audience, and we need to broaden our reach. And how do we really do that effectively? Or are we, building and material stewards? Are we just, we only work on cultural or heritage buildings of significance? Like that's not really the case anymore, but how do we navigate in this space and still, support our members in the best way, but also integrate and make sure our voice is at the table, because we've been doing it for the longest amount of time and we have so many lessons learned to share with everyone. But how to collaborate, which I guess is sort of, why a lot of us are at the ZNCC, why the ZNCC was created in the first place, as a way to sort of effectively disseminate information that all of our organizations are working on. But then how do we cross-educate? How do we do all of this together effectively, that we kind of know what little bubble of the big piece or systemic piece that we're working on, and how to link that all together is sort of the biggest question at the moment. I'm hoping that some of the work that's going on in the Circular Construction Innovation Hub will link a lot of those actors together, because they're starting to talk the same topics that have been important to us, as a way to, bring data together, bring policy together, and have us be sort of the technical support and able to share at a really high level. But it's sort of an open-ended question on how to best work together and break down silos. I think that's it. This is me. If you're interested in anything I presented today, feel free to reach out and I'll direct you. And I'll, in the chat, after I stop sharing my screen, I'll put a whole bunch of contact emails for everyone I referenced today.